Hello everyone and welcome to this new video about the Go programming language. And today we're going to look at functions. So if you come from other languages, maybe you're already familiar with the concept of functions. But regardless, in this video we're going to introduce functions as if you never heard of them. So throughout the series we already worked with functions implicitly because, as you can see here, this keyword here, func, in front of the keyword main, is actually a keyword used to designate this sort of a function. And in fact, the function main with which we have been working with for the entirety of this video series is actually a function. But now let's try to explain what a function is. So in computer science, actually there's a more subtle distinction between functions and procedures. So now we're going to define both. So what are procedures? So procedures are just a block of reusable code, which however does not have an output, we could say. So in languages like C or like also in like Golang, a procedure is represented by a void function, also known as a function that returns nothing. Okay, whereas a function is basically something which takes an input and gives out an output. So in principle, we, of course, practically speaking, we use both functions and procedures as ways to basically write code more compactly by writing these blocks of code that we can then reuse. But again, the difference is that functions take an input and then return an output via the return keyword, whereas procedures actually not return any output. This distinction is more, we could say, in languages like Pascal, if you've ever used it. If not, it's just an historical note. In languages like Pascal, there's more emphasis on this distinction. In languages like C, we just have functions, and in Golang as well, we just have functions. So when we will have an output, we will have properly what is called function. In the case in which the function returns void, that just means the function returns nothing, then we have a procedure. So let's start and say, well, we have seen that a function is basically a block of reusable code that takes an input and then spits out an output via a keyword that's called return. And then this function can be called inside our code and executes all the code that is inside the function delimiter. And this makes the code way cleaner, and this is why they're so useful. But now let's see actually how to define a function. So in order to define a function, we need first to use the keyword func. This designates the start of a function. Then we're gonna specify the name of the function. So in this case, let's call it, for example, test function. And now notice that when you will work with more big programs, when you want to write, for example, in a file, a function that is also exported, you want to write it with a capital letter, as well as variables. If you want to export a variable to other files, you have to write them with a capital starting letter. In this case, we're still working, with a single file, so we don't have to worry about it. And technically, you're still working, if you have not installed yet a Go environment on your computer. We will do that once we have covered the basics. You're probably still using, as I recommended in the description, the Go Playground website to, we could say, experiment these features of the language. So to define a function, we basically first start by first defining the name of the function, then putting these two braces here, and then we're going to put behind inside curly braces the actual code of the function. So now we said the functions can have an input and can produce an output. Okay, but how can we designate it? Because at the current state, our function does not take any input, and also it returns no output. So in order to take an input, we are going to specify it inside these braces here, these parentheses. And in particular, we're going to designate the output that it's going to take with a name, for example, x, and then we're going to specify its type. So let's suppose we want to write a test function that takes in two integers, and then prints out to the console their sum. So in order to denote that we're going to take two integers as an input, we're going to use an identifier to denote the first input, then specify its type, then use a comma, and then another identifier for the second input, as well as its type. So we have said that we want to print out to the console their sum. So what we're going to do is going to print out x plus y. But notice we have not returned anything, so the function actually does not have a return value. For this reason, this function returns void. This is actually, technically speaking, a procedure. So let's now, in order to call our function, we need to call it inside our main. because as we said earlier, the difference between a scripting language and a programming language, in a programming language, as for example Golang, in Go, main is the main entry point of the program. That is where the code that gets executed will be written. So in order for us to execute a function, we need to call it inside the main entry point. And inside the main entry point, we're going to call test function with 5 and 10. This should print out to the console 15. Let's see if it works. As you can see, we get 15. So this is the basics of how to write a procedure, so a function that returns nothing. But what if we want to return something from this function? So let's suppose now that we do not want to print this value, but rather we want this function to return the sum. So in order to specify that this function is going to return a value of a specified type, we need to denote it by putting the type that is going to get returned in front of the name of the functions after the parentheses, just like this. And then we're going to return the value that we desire, in this case x plus y. Now that we have to return this value, for example, we can store the result, the output of this function inside a new variable, and for example print it out to the console. So let's see what the result will be now. As you can see, it will be 15, but now the function actually returns the value. So we have it, basically when we call the function, we can store it, for example, inside a variable, and then we can print our variable out. But we can also do other things with that variable. For example, we can print out that variable plus 7, and then we will get 22, for example. That's an example of something we can do. And now, of course, you can write also functions that can, for example, take strings as an input. So you can say print a string, something like that. Then it's going to take a text string, and then it's going to return nothing. It's just going to print out to the console. It's just going to print out console that string. So for example, in this case, let's actually call it. So for example, print string of hello, and as you can see now, the output will be hello as intended. So these are the basics of functions. Now we can also have another way of returning values to functions. So instead of saying here, for example, the type, let's suppose that now we want to return a string here, and let's change it to, for example, say hello, and we're gonna, for example, return a string that's gonna be hello and then the name of the person that we're gonna pass in. Well, what we can do is we can actually define the variable that's going to be returned precisely here at specified type. So for example, we can already specify here the name of our return value that can be output, and this is an identifier, so you can put an arbitrary name, for example type string. Then we're going to put the output equals to hello plus then the text, for example, then return. And as you can see here, we do not need to specify what we return because it's already specified up here. And then by, for example, calling this function, say hello, actually let's assign it to a variable x, then let's from print line x, let's see what we get. We should get hello Jacob, as you can see, as intended. And so this is also how we can use named output values. We can also have functions that return more than one value. For example, let's define a function calculator that takes two integers and then returns their product and their sum. To specify that we're going to have two outputs, we're going to use these parentheses and then specify inside the types of the two return values. So for example, we're going to call the return value number 1 z is going to be x plus y, and then w is going to be x times y. Then we're going to return z and y and then w, and let's see what happens. Also, to get the output of this function, we're going to need two variables inside of where we call it. So for example, if we decide to store the return values inside two variables, we're going to need two variables in this case because the output scores two integers. So we're going to say t and r is equal to calculator of 2 and 5, and so what we expect to get is that t will be equal to 7 and then r will be equal to 10. So let's try to print both of them out. Let's see what we get. And also another important thing, you can also combine basically multiple return values also with names. So basically, as we did before, we specified a name for our return value. For example, we can set it equal to z and this to y, so this to w. Then we can do this and we will get the same result. So With this said, we have said almost everything about functions, and in the next video we will look at another type of functions, and that is anonymous functions.